This is a demo video for the feature vSphere Datastore Cluster State Synchronization in Apache CloudStack 4.15.1. In CloudStack 4.15 release, we have already introduced vSphere advanced capabilities. As part of it, Datastore cluster support as a storage pool is already there. So now we are introducing this feature. Before going to the actual demo, I'll quickly show how to add a new Datastore cluster into CloudStack, and then I'll explain what's the new improvement on top of it. So if you look into this vCenter, we have already a Datastore cluster configured in it, and we have two data stores already added into this Datastore cluster. Now I'm going to add this Datastore cluster as a storage pool in CloudStack. So before that, let me grab the vCenter IP. Now I'm adding a Datastore cluster as a primary storage here, giving it as a name Datastore cluster, selecting the protocol type as Datastore cluster. The server is vCenter server IP here, and the vCenter data center is trillion. And the Datastore is the name of the Datastore cluster here, which is Datastore cluster itself. So the Datastore cluster is already added as a storage pool here. If you look into the storage pool table, we have this new entry here, which is DS cluster, which is added at a storage pool, and followed by that we have two new entries which refers to the child data stores. These are not visible in UI, but these are under this data store cluster. If you see, we have a new parent column here mentioning 9 on the child storage pools, which refers that this is the 9 is the parent of these two child storage pools. 9 is the data store cluster here. So after adding this data store cluster, all the volume operations works normally as the other storage pools. So the improvement that we are making here is once the data store cluster is already added into CloudStack, any changes made on this data store cluster, they cannot be synchronized directly in CloudStack after adding it here. If I add a new data store into this data store cluster, or if I remove the existing data stores from this data store cluster, that state cannot be synchronized in data store in CloudStack here. For that to reflect in CloudStack, we have to remove this data store cluster and re-add it into CloudStack. So to improve that, we have this new feature in 4.15 Apache CloudStack 4.15.1, which does the data store cluster state synchronization without having to remove the data store cluster and re-add it again. So if we go into the data store cluster here, we have a new action here for the data store cluster, which says sync storage pool. So upon clicking this, sync storage pool API is called, and the whatever the new state on the data store cluster at vCenter will be synchronized in CloudStack. Let's do a quick demo of the cases that are included here. So now I'm going to add a new data store into the data store cluster here. So I have a data store 3 here. I'm going to add this in data store cluster. So now vCenter has vCenter has a data store cluster, which in turn has 3 data stores in it. In order to synchronize that state into CloudStack, we need to call this API sync storage pool. I'm doing that now. So the sync storage pool of this data store cluster is successful. If you look into the storage pool table here, we have a new entry of data store 3, which which has the parent of 9, which is the data store cluster. So CloudStack also reflects the same, having 3 data stores inside the data store cluster. This is one case. The other case is removing of an existing data store from the data store cluster. So now I'm going to take out the data store 2 from the data store cluster. So data store 2 is not part of the data store cluster here. So if we have to synchronize this state in vCenter to CloudStack, we have to call the same API again, which is sync storage pool. So now I'm doing that now. So sync storage pool is successful. And if you look into the storage pool table, data store 2 is not pointing to the parent DS cluster. DS cluster has only 2 storage pools, which are data store 1 and data store 3. Data store is not part of DS cluster. If you observe here, in this case of removing the child data store out of the data store cluster, we are not actually completely deleting it from CloudStack. Instead, we are making data store 2 as an independent storage pool. If you go back to the primary storages list here, you can see data stores 2 as an independent storage pool here. This is because before actually removing it from the data store cluster, there can be volumes on this storage pool and they should not get lost. So to avoid that, we are making this as an independent storage pool. This is the same behavior on vCenter also. If we remove that data store 2 from the data store cluster, data store 2 becomes an independent data store here, which we are doing the same here. So that's about the synchronization. Apart from the sync storage pool API, synchronization also happens when we put the data store cluster in maintenance mode. When we trigger this enable maintenance mode, even then synchronization happens. The other scenario when the synchronization happens is when the host tries to connect to the storage pools. That usually happens when we restart the management server or when we do a force connect on the hosts. This is all about the this feature vSphere data store cluster state synchronization. Thank you all.